That Russian cargo plane downed last week, carrying dozens of Ukrainian POWs for an exchange with Russia, was shot down by a U.S.-made Patriot air defense system. That, according to Russia's investigative committee in a statement released Thursday. The statement said Ukraine fired 2 missiles from a staging area in Kharkov region, not far from the village of Lipsy, about 10 kilometers from the Russian border. The investigators said they found 116 missile fragments bearing inscriptions in English referring to Patriot security classifications and listing the name Raytheon. Raytheon is one of the designers of the Patriot air defense missile system. There were 65 Ukrainian POWs, 3 Russian military personnel, and 6 crew members on board, all of whom died in the crash a week ago Wednesday. While the incident initially cast doubt on further prisoner exchanges, this past Wednesday, Russia and Ukraine conducted the largest such swap to date, with each side turning over 195 service members. Chris Black is an attorney specializing in international law. We spoke with him via Zoom about this case on Thursday. Chris, thanks for your time. An interesting development with the release of this information from Russia that it appears it was a U.S. Patriot missile that took down that plane with Ukrainian POWs.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting because nobody knows why they would have done it. The Russians are confused. President Putin, I think, said today or yesterday that it could be they wanted to embarrass Russia and blame them, or maybe it was an accident. They meant to hit another military plane. But in either case, it's criminal negligence or maybe deliberate murder. And since it was shot down by a Patriot missile, it means a Patriot missile battery manned by mainly U.S. personnel. Now, which makes the American government responsible for the murder of those prisoners because they took part in that shootdown. And it relates to if we go back last year, the Ukrainians also bombed a prison camp or barracks that the Russians were holding some Ukrainian prisoners near the front before they transferred them back into Russia. And the Ukrainians bombed that and tried to blame Russia for doing it. They tried to embarrass Russia by saying Russia bombed its own installation. So they're quite capable of doing it. They've done it before, murdered their own men to make Russia look bad or some other strange point. And then it relates back to the shoot down of MH17 in 2014, which they tried to blame on Russia, but the evidence indicates it was a Kiev NATO operation. So they're quite capable of murdering people for their own interests, whatever they may be. But I think the American people and Congress should be aware that President Biden's forces were involved in the murder of all those Ukrainian prisoners, and yet he claims he's defending Ukraine.
And they're talking about, by the way, in addition to those things, what they called the greatest environmental catastrophe in history. They were capable of doing that, too, when they blew up those pipelines.
That's right. The gas pipeline, when the Americans, was quite clear, probably the British as well, blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in the North Sea. The release of gas from there was enormous. And yet Biden claims to be an environmentally friendly president. But that operation not only was an attack on Germany, which Germany has acquiesced in, they don't dare retaliate or do anything about it, but it was an attack on Germany to force them to buy American gas and cut off the supply of Russian gas to Europe. But yeah, but it's an environmental disaster as well.
Yeah,
they release so much methane. I mean, I think as much as Europe puts out in a year, they put out in just a few days.
And the on the other end of it, the gas that's being supplied by the U.S., the additional gases from fracking in the large,
right,
which is also an environmental catastrophe happening here.
Right, and how long that frack gas is going to last, because they're searching in the deep depths of the earth to try and find what's left of the gas supply in the United States. So they're fracking because the big basins of gas are drained. So I don't see how that can last, except the price is going to shoot up for the Europeans because it's becoming. I just saw something about there's too much gas, so they're cutting the number of LNG terminals in the United States. I don't understand that, but it may be because they know that there's not going to be enough gas to supply them.
I just don't get it. The impunity that this rests on, is there any recourse that anyone has? Can the U.S. get dragged to the ICJ, for example, for enabling the shoot down of these prisoners in the instant case? And And actually, should someone in Ukraine be looking at that?
They should be, but the Kremlin's complaining that they've asked the West, the United States, tell us, help us investigate this. But they said they're being refused at all points. And Kiev, from what I know, has not begun an investigation. They won't, because they know exactly what happened. Why would they investigate? They know what happened. But yeah, if the United States could be, the officers and officials could face criminal charges at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but not the ICJ. But the ICC will not do anything. And they have a file on Ukraine open for a long time, but they're not going to lay charges against the Ukrainians. They're not going to lay them against any NATO people either, because the ICC is bought and paid for by the EU and by the West.
I'm wondering about the pattern of behavior, I guess. The United States, the world's largest arms salesperson, and the shoot down of that plane is a product of those sales or gifts or whatever transaction happens behind the transfer. And of course, pretty much every death that's happened in Ukraine and in Israel and a whole bunch of other places are also products of that same thing. They've had all this litigation here. The Democrats are go crazy over this too, that they want to sue arms manufacturers for every kid that shoots up a school or whatever, and that they'd have liability. But what about in terms of criminal culpability on the part of a state that enables, these massive arms transfers that result in massive casualties?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no way of charging somebody just for supplying weapons. It's not. Let me put it this way. The United States is responsible, and Canada and all the other NATO countries, they're complicit, they're co-belligerents in the war, the attack on the Donbass republics and Russia and this war in Ukraine. They can't, I don't agree that people say this is a proxy war. This is a direct war. They're co-belligerents. They're directly parties to the war. Major forces aren't committed yet. They're using Ukrainian forces to do their work, but it's a war against Russia. So supplying arms and weapons and ammunition which are used in war crimes is a war crime, because they're co-belligerents. So they would be parties to the any allegation of war crimes against Ukraine that also apply to the United States and every other NATO ally. But nothing will come of it because it'd have to be done at the ICC. You can't go to the ICJ with that because it would be criminal. And then it wouldn't be against the state. It would be against the president, personnel, like individuals of the state, the head of state. So, but like Milosevic was charged, although he was head of state, he was charged as an individual.
I don't know. What could come? I don't know, local legal issues or something that could come out of this shoot down.
I think people can. I think it's what people should think about. Since the ICC is not going to do anything, and the international law is not going to accomplish anything in stopping wars, I don't see that happening. They seem to enable these wars, unfortunately, even though they're designed on paper to do the opposite. So what do people do? If I was an American or Canadian, I would suggest filing lawsuits against the government in local courts, compelling them to obey the law, international law, because international law is part of domestic law. Right. And they should file suits asking for an order for mandamus, which an order by the court compelling government officials to do what they're supposed to do under the law. And you could file that in the federal court system, compelling the government to obey the UN Charter, to obey all these international treaties about conventions against war and humanitarian aid, and see what happens. In Canada, we have a National Defence Act, which forbids the deployment of Canadian forces overseas except as UN peacekeepers or if NATO's attacked. And officially, NATO hasn't been attacked yet. And Ukraine, for instance, or Syria or Afghanistan are not part of any NATO thing. I mean, not part of any UN operation. So Canada, in that instance, was violating its own National Defence Act. You can't do that. When I wrote to the Minister of Defence here, he sent me back a nice letter saying, thank you. You're right, but we rely on royal prerogative. We get around that by relying on the royal prerogative, which simply means that despite the law, we can do anything we want to.
Wow.
And that's the attitude you got in your country. Despite the law, we will do whatever we want. But that's what the state of the world we're in. That the international law means nothing to these really gangster states we're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the basis of their impunity for sure, that not having to answer for any of this tells
Right.
them, well, you don't have to answer for any of this.
No.
Thanks a lot.
Except their own people, maybe one day to their own people.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that day.
Yeah, we all are.
But thank you very much. I appreciate this.
You're welcome.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.